Welcome to the debate. Imagine a CEO sitting across from you in the boardroom. They have, completely nailed every financial metric.
Right. The quarterly earnings are consistently in the black.
Exactly. Their portfolio's bulletproof, and by every conventional measure, they've won the game. But their marriage is disintegrating.
Yeah. Or a stress-induced heart attack is looming.
Right. And they are just paralyzed by the daily terror of losing it all. So on the show today, we're tackling a deeply uncomfortable premise for executive coaches and financial advisors. What if financial poverty is just a symptom and the true disease is, well, holistic?
It fundamentally challenges what we do in those advising sessions, doesn't it? I mean, we're trained to treat wealth as an exact science.
You input the right variables, you get the right output.
Exactly. You optimize the tax strategy, and you're good. But when you guide actual human beings through profound financial uncertainty, you quickly realize that money is often merely a lagging indicator of much deeper issues.
And that tension is exactly what we're exploring today, drawn from the framework in Pathway to Wealth and Poverty Redefined. We're looking at how to guide clients out of persistent hardship to build a lasting legacy.
Which is no small task.
No, it's not. And I'm arguing that wealth building is primarily a cognitive exercise. It requires shifting a client out of a poverty mentality, specifically moving them from short-term consumption traps to a rigorous, long-term investment model. High-level decision-making and defeating what the framework calls ignorant poverty it's the empirical engine of prosperity.
And I'll argue that treating high-level executives like rational algorithms is exactly why so many advisors ultimately fail their clients.
Fail them? That's a strong word.
But it's true. Poverty isn't just bad math. It's multidimensional. It's systemic. Sometimes it operates as an entirely irrational spiritual block or a curse.
A curse. Okay.
Yes. If you have a client suffering from profound social isolation, physical decay, or spiritual barrenness, fixing their cognitive models is essentially putting premium gas into a car with a blown transmission. I mean, the energy might be there, but the vessel is broken.
Well, let's test that, and let's ground it in the reality of a coaching session. When a client comes to me in a financial tailspin, I don't start by analyzing their spiritual vessel,
Fair enough.
I look at their operating paradigm. Consider the delayed gratification test outlined in our source material. If you offer someone $1 million today versus $1 compounded at 100% every month for 30 months.
Sure. Anyone with a calculator knows the compounded dollar yields over $500 million. It's a standard thought experiment.
But it's not just the thought experiment. It reveals the psychological friction of applying wealth mechanics. A poverty mentality is inherently reactive, right? It demands the $1 million now to consume it.
To satisfy an immediate pressure. Yeah.
Exactly. Or project an image of success. When I'm advising an ego-driven executive whose company is bleeding cash, they almost always want the quick influx of capital to patch the hole. They want the $1 million today.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
You're assuming that if you just install the right software, the hardware will run perfectly. But human beings facing deep uncertainty aren't rational machines.
Well, my immediate priority has to be a cognitive intervention. We have to map out a clear sequence. Phase 1 is identifying those immediate consumption traps, and Phase 2 is installing the compounding paradigm as a daily habit.
As a framework for making decisions, right?
Yes. You can't heal a holistic vessel if the client is still actively hemorrhaging resources because their decision-making matrix is wired for instant gratification.
Okay, let's look at what happens when your executive actually adopts that compounding paradigm. They run the math, they delay the gratification, they build a perfect strategic plan.
And they succeed.
No, and then, right at the finish line, the deal inexplicably collapses. The investor pulls out, the market shifts bizarrely against them, a freak supply chain issue torpedoes the launch.
Well, external factors happen.
But it happens effortlessly, over and over. Our framework refers to this systemic repeated failure as an empowerment to fail, or, quite literally, a curse.
Look, I realize the emotional devastation of that scenario. The almost there syndrome is agonizing for anyone.
It really is.
When a client does everything right, follows the blueprint, and still loses, it absolutely feels like they're carrying some kind of dark cloud. The psychological weight of constant disappointment makes it feel like a curse.
Because practically it acts like one. When you have a highly capable leader constantly hitting near-success failures, a better spreadsheet doesn't fix it. You can't just put remove empowerment to fail on a Q3 action plan. The purely cognitive approach treats this systemic, almost atmospheric block as a mere data deficit.
I wouldn't call it a mere data deficit, though. I'd classify it as ignorant poverty. And I want to be precise about how a coach tackles this because it's highly actionable.
How so?
Ignorant poverty isn't just lacking a piece of trivia. It's a fundamental, often ego-driven blind spot in an executive's worldview. When a client repeatedly fails at the edge of a breakthrough, it's rarely mystical.
So what is it then?
It's usually because their arrogance prevents them from seeing a deformed negotiation tactic, or they're misreading the subtext of their board's risk tolerance. Ignorant poverty is dangerous precisely because it's invisible to the person suffering from it.
They think they're doing everything right?
Exactly. By forcing them to confront that blind spot, by introducing targeted, sometimes painful, new knowledge, you break the cycle. You replace the limiting pattern. That's how you lift the curse in a boardroom.
But that still presumes the executive is ultimately in control of all the variables if they just get smart enough. That's the arrogance of modern advising, honestly.
I don't think it's arrogance to empower the client.
We completely ignore the external nature of poverty. Think about the illustration provided in the material, the man dressed in rags pushing a trash cart through the streets of New York.
Right. Navigating through one of the wealthiest financial hubs on the planet.
Exactly. The environment doesn't cure his condition. The framework points out that poverty functions like a spirit or a garment.
A garment?
Yes, it attaches itself to people and it has absolutely no respect for age, status, title, or location. This is vital for us to understand when coaching high-level executives. A title like managing director is not a protective shield.
Of course not.
When an executive faces a devastating, unexplainable financial crisis, despite their qualifications, it's often because they've allowed this universal state of lack to permeate their life. You have to address that deep-seated barrenness before you try to optimize their portfolio.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. I interpret that New York example quite differently.
Oh, how so?
The man pushing the cart in a wealthy city perfectly illustrates the disconnect between physical environment and mental reality. This brings us to what the text calls mental poverty.
Which is just the lack of ideas.
Yes, but you can drop a person with a barren mind into the middle of Wall Street and they will still be poor, because ideas are the literal currency of progress.
Okay, but
If an executive builds a massive fortune on one great idea but lacks cognitive agility, what happens when the market disrupts that industry? They lose the money.
right.
Our framework is unequivocal here. Having money without the capacity to generate new ideas eventually leads to losing that money. The garment of poverty you're talking about isn't a mystical attachment, it's intellectual stagnation.
How do you actually coach that, though? You can't just look an arrogant CEO in the eye and command them to have better ideas.
You don't command them. You systematically dismantle their reliance on their past success. You institute daily habits of stress testing their assumptions.
Like playing devil's advocate with their own strategies?
Exactly. You force them to argue the opposite side of their own business model. You require them to consume information far outside their industry. That's how you cure mental poverty.
I hear the mechanics of what you're saying, and I don't disagree that cognitive agility is important.
It builds a cognitive engine that continually generates value.
Sure. But you're still treating the executive as an isolated brain in a jar. Let's zoom out to the actual goal of this coaching. We aren't just trying to engineer a corporate turnaround so they can buy another vacation home, are we?
No, we are supposedly helping them build a lasting legacy, true prosperity.
Right. But if we evaluate their life across the 7 dimensions outlined in our framework, financial and mental wealth are only the first 2 steps.
They're the foundational steps.
What happens when your cognitive engine produces massive wealth, but the executive suffers from profound social poverty? They have millions, but their spouse has filed for divorce, their children don't speak to them, and they have no one to share the success with.
That is a terrible outcome, yes.
Relational poverty destroys the utility of the wealth. Or take physical poverty. You push the CEO to generate ideas relentlessly, to delay gratification, and the stress destroys their health. A massive portfolio is entirely useless if you don't have the physical vitality to live long enough to deploy it.
I totally agree. I absolutely agree that a life destroyed by stress or isolation is a tragedy. Health and relationships are undeniably vital markers of a successful life.
Then why prioritize the math?
Because from an advising standpoint, we have to respect the sequence of transformation. If I have a client staring down bankruptcy, I can't start our session by recommending they join a social club to cure their relational poverty,
Well, obviously not a social club, but
Overcoming the immediate financial crisis buys the margin necessary to address those other areas.
that's the trap, though. I'll fix my health after the IPO. I'll repair my marriage after this quarter's earnings.
But sometimes that's the reality of a crisis.
It's a sequence that perpetually pushes holistic well-being over the horizon. The relentless pursuit of the financial dimension is often the exact mechanism driving the physical and social poverty. You're feeding the disease to cure the symptom.
But you have to stop the bleeding first. If the company goes under, the stress of that collapse will shatter their physical health and their marriage anyway. High-level financial decision-making has to lead the way because it provides the structural foundation.
A structural foundation for what, exactly?
Once we've installed that investment mentality and eliminated the ignorant poverty causing the crisis, they actually have the resources, the time, the capital, the mental bandwidth to invest in their physical and relational legacy. It's about sequencing the solutions.
That assumes they'll suddenly change their nature once they hit a certain net worth, but we both know they don't. And that brings us to the most critical and often most ignored dimensions: non-achievement and spiritual poverty.
Non-achievement is an interesting one.
Look at non-achievement. You can coach an executive to be incredibly rich, to have brilliant ideas, but their life is ultimately summarized as they were born, they accumulated capital, and they died. There's no generational impact, no broader meaning.
Which is exactly why legacy planning is a core component of long-term advising. You structure trusts, you set up philanthropic foundations.
But legacy isn't just a trust fund. It requires overcoming spiritual poverty, which our framework defines as lacking faith and a covenant relationship with the higher purpose.
I always struggle with the pragmatism of that in a professional setting.
I know bringing spirituality into financial advising sounds taboo, especially with empiricists. But the pragmatism of it is undeniable if you look closely at human behavior.
How does faith translate to a boardroom strategy during a crisis, though?
Because it entirely reframes the executive's relationship with risk and control. If an executive's entire identity is tethered to their net worth, a market downturn isn't just a financial problem, it's an existential threat.
And that drives panic.
Yes. That panic is what triggers the deformed short-term decision-making you're so worried about. They grab the $1 million today out of sheer terror.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
But when an executive overcomes spiritual poverty, when they cultivate faith and understand that material possessions are ultimately temporary, that there's a reality beyond physical accumulation, their grip on the money loosens. They aren't consumed by the fear of losing it.
So it lowers the stakes for them mentally.
Cultivating faith acts as an anchor. It gives them the freedom to make grounded, truly long-term decisions because their worth isn't on the line with every quarterly report. It cures the empowerment to fail at its root.
I respect the psychological stabilizing effect of having a higher purpose. If an executive realizes that money isn't the ultimate measure of their soul, they probably do make calmer, more rational decisions. It lowers the temperature in the room.
Exactly.
But I have to push back on prioritizing this over the empirical steps. If you try to cure a failing business model by focusing on spiritual detachment, you run the risk of masking incompetence with enlightenment.
Masking incompetence?
Yes, you can be at total peace with your spirituality and still drive your company into the ground because you don't understand market dynamics.
I'm not suggesting you ignore the balance sheet. I'm suggesting the balance sheet is a reflection of the person's holistic state.
And I'm arguing that the holistic state is often a luxury afforded by financial competence. Let's trace the actual phases of breaking these poverty patterns for a client.
All right, let's hear the sequence.
You can't just leap to spiritual enlightenment when the bank is calling in the loan. The client first has to recognize the immediate behavioral traps, the consumption habits bleeding them dry.
Sure.
Then they have to deliberately adopt the compounding investment mentality. They have to embrace delayed gratification. Once they master that, they tackle the mental poverty by learning how to generate and execute new ideas.
Which takes years, by the way.
But that sequence creates the literal wealth that allows them the breathing room to ask those deeper existential questions about legacy and spiritual purpose. If they don't understand how to compound value first, they're just philosophizing while the ship sinks.
But again, compounding value is meaningless if the vessel holding that value is riddled with holes.
I don't think it's meaningless.
When a client's core belief system is rooted in a state of lack, whether that's a lack of physical vitality, social connection, or spiritual grounding, they will unconsciously sabotage their financial gains. They will return to their comfortable baseline of poverty because it matches their internal reality.
Self-sabotage is definitely a factor, yes.
They'll blow up the deal, alienate the key investor, or literally work themselves into a hospital bed. The holistic dimensions aren't a luxury you address after the money is right. They're the prerequisites for keeping the money long-term.
So you're arguing that internal spiritual wholeness is the prerequisite for financial success.
Essentially, yes.
And I'm arguing that cognitive and financial competence is the prerequisite for securing the space to achieve that holistic wholeness.
Which means we're staring at the exact same blueprint, just arguing over which floor to build first.
That's actually a very fair assessment. Let's pull this all together and look at where these frameworks actually lead a coach and a client.
Sounds good.
My stance remains firmly rooted in the cognitive mechanics. To guide a client out of a persistent crisis, you must replace their outdated consumption mentality with an empirical investment mindset. Conquering ignorant poverty through the relentless acquisition of knowledge and curing mental poverty by fostering a fertile idea-generating brain are the non-negotiable first steps.
Even if their life has fallen apart otherwise?
You simply cannot build a lasting legacy if you don't possess the intellectual and financial frameworks to sustain it. The math has to work.
And I maintain that if your advising stops at the intellect, you are fundamentally failing the client. True coaching requires acknowledging that financial metrics are secondary to the broader human experience.
Secondary but necessary.
Necessary but not the ultimate goal. The systemic, often unexplainable barriers to success, that empowerment to fail, can only be broken by addressing the person holistically, curing social isolation, prioritizing physical health, and overcoming spiritual poverty by anchoring their identity outside of their net worth. These are the true drivers of a lasting legacy.
Right.
Without them, you just have a wealthy person who has achieved nothing of real meaning.
Well, what we clearly agree on is how dangerous it is to measure wealth solely by a bank account. Our framework is definitive there. Poverty is a state of lack, but money is only one of 7 distinct things a person can lack.
And that convergence is crucial. It changes the entire diagnostic landscape in the boardroom. We just continue to respectfully diverge on the sequence, whether the intellectual paradigm shift has to lead the charge or whether multidimensional healing is required first to stop the unconscious self-sabotage.
It demands a profound level of honesty. When you evaluate success through all 7 lenses, financial, mental, social, physical, non-achievement, ignorant, and spiritual, it forces you to look far beyond the spreadsheets.
It really does. Whether you're the coach leading the session or the executive navigating the uncertainty, it challenges you to look in the mirror and ask, which dimension of poverty is quietly running the show in my life right now?
That is the real work of legacy building. The math might tell you if you're in the red or the black, but true prosperity requires examining the vessel itself. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.